Hello, my name is Nathan and I want to thank you for watching my channel's very first video. And for the first video, I want to talk about the 2016 presidential primaries. Now the primaries have been pretty contentious, but the intent of this video is not to try to get you to vote one way or another for a candidate. The intention of this video is just to inform on a candidate and their particular history with a policy. So the topic of today is Bernie Sanders' history with gun control. Now, Hillary Clinton has attacked Bernie Sanders for not being liberal enough on this policy, and Bernie Sanders has described himself as a moderate on this policy. However, I've found that both campaigns and the media have not really been very clear or very informative on this issue, so this video is intending to fill that gap of information. So to understand Bernie Sanders' long history with gun policies, you have to go all the way back to his first election in 1990. By the way, I'll be using some notes. It's my first video. Thank you again for watching. Please bear with me. I don't want to get names or dates wrong. So in 1990, Bernie Sanders ran against incumbent Republican Peter Smith. And the NRA and gun enthusiasts of Vermont supported Bernie Sanders over the Republican incumbent, which is kind of weird. An independent socialist against a Republican incumbent, most people would think that the NRA would support the Republican. So why didn't he? Well, it's because Peter Smith, in his last election, had promised to oppose assault rifle bans. But when he got to Congress, he had a change of heart and decided instead to vote in favor of assault rifle bans. The NRA and gun enthusiasts were upset that he hadn't kept his word. So, they decided to favor the only other legitimate candidate during this election, which was Bernie Sanders. Now, guns were not the only issue during this election, and it's not the only reason that Bernie won, but it was an extremely important reason, an extremely important issue, and it kind of started off Bernie Sanders' long history with guns. During the election, Bernie Sanders didn't promise to oppose assault rifle bans. He did, however, promise to oppose any bill that had a waiting period provision in it. So basically, he promised to oppose bills that state even if you put in the proper paperwork, you have to wait 5 days before you get your gun. He promised to vote against that waiting period. That becomes relevant in later bills. So let's jump into his actual time in Congress with the first major gun legislation he voted on, the Brady Bill. Now, Hillary Clinton has given Bernie Sanders a hard time for not voting for the Brady Bill, saying that it wasn't very liberal of him. I'll leave that for you to decide by the end, whether it was good or bad. But basically, the Brady Bill was named after James Brady, a victim of gun violence in an attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan. The bill had a couple of key provisions, the main ones being, one, that there is now federal background checks are required for federally licensed gun dealers. So anyone buying a gun from a federally licensed gun dealer now has to do a background check. The next provision of the bill was stating that these people can't pass a background check, so these people can't buy a gun. It included people who had committed domestic violence. It included people who were listed as mentally unfit by the state. It included felons. Weirdly, it included fugitives. I didn't know fugitives from the law were allowed to legally buy guns prior to the Brady Bill. I think that sounds kind of weird, but apparently they were. So Bernie Sanders voted against the Brady Bill and all those provisions. But it's important to note why. The Brady Bill had another smaller provision that stated that there would be a 5-day waiting period for the purchase of handguns. And if you remember, Bernie Sanders promised his constituents that he would vote against any bill with a waiting period. He followed through on that promise and voted against the Brady Bill and all the other provisions because of the waiting period one. You can decide for yourself whether that's a good reason to vote against it, whether you wanted him to vote for it or wanted him to vote against it. Totally up to you, but those are the facts of that particular policy he voted on. So let's move on to the next major piece of legislation that he voted on that's talked a lot about in this election cycle, and that's the Firearms Manufacturing Protection Bill. Now, when the media and politicians talk about the gun manufacturers and gun sellers having immunity from civil lawsuits, this is the bill that they're talking about. Bernie Sanders voted in favor of giving legal immunity, civil legal immunity, to gun manufacturers and gun sellers. So what does that mean? It means that unless you fall into an exception, you're not allowed to sue the gun manufacturers. The exceptions are one, criminal If a gun manufacturer or seller knows that they're selling a gun to a criminal or to someone who they know is going to use the gun illegally, you can still sue them for doing that. The second exception is if a gun malfunctions and hurts you by malfunctioning. So if you shoot a gun and it blows up and you no longer have a hand, you can still sue the gun manufacturer for that. But outside of those two exceptions and a few other smaller exceptions, you can't sue the gun companies. It's really hard to sue the gun companies, and it's because of this bill. Now, immunity is not uncommon in the United States. A lot of companies have immunity for specific kind of lawsuits. What's strange about this particular immunity is that it was granted by Congress and it's so broad. Normally, immunity is sort of decided by the courts. They determine for legal reasons why a certain company or a certain thing should be immune. But in this case, Congress intervened and passed a law giving gun manufacturers really sweeping immunity. And the main reason that I found at the time why gun manufacturers were given immunity was because gun manufacturers were worried they didn't have the finances to defend themselves against so many lawsuits, which seems a little strange to me because I know gun manufacturers have a lot of money. I suppose they could be talking about smaller gun sellers, but it's still a strange argument, and it's still kind of strange that Congress intervened in such a big and broad way. Now, people fall on both sides of this issue. Those who favor the immunity say, why should a gun seller or gun manufacturer be sued for what a person does with their gun after it's been legally purchased? Why are they held responsible? There's some legitimacy to that argument. It's probably overly simplifying that issue. The people who are against the immunity, they argue that companies in this country get sued all the time, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad, but those lawsuits at least have their day in court to determine whether they're legitimate. And this law basically takes away the right to go to court to sue the gun companies. So they say, why do the gun companies get this level of immunity when other companies do not, and why is it taking away people's rights to sue, basically? A good example of this would be the 2008 financial crisis, when the banks and mortgage companies, what they were doing that caused the crisis, not everything they were doing was illegal. In fact, most of it was probably legal. It was just really sketchy and bad. But under this kind of immunity, you couldn't sue them just because it was sketchy or bad. It had to be illegal. So people who are against the immunity could list that as kind of an example as why they are against this broad level of community. I will include a link in the description below that has more information about this bill and about the immunity it provides. But basically, it's one of the broadest immunities given to a company, and Bernie Sanders voted in favor of it. You can decide whether that's good or whether that's bad. So those are the two biggest bills that he's voted on in relation to guns that are talked about during this election. I'll run through very quickly a few other policies and how he sort of gravitated and voted on them. And so when it comes to assault rifles, Bernie Sanders has voted for a ban on assault rifles 3 times. When it comes to the use of guns in national parks and on Amtrak trains, Bernie Sanders has voted in favor of allowing guns in national parks and on trains. He's also voted in favor of training plane pilots on how to use guns and having pilots having guns. Guns on planes scare me because I think a plane depressurizes if you shoot a gun through the wall. But that fear is for anyone having a gun. I guess it's probably better for a trained pilot to have it than somebody random on the plane, but I digress. The next bill he voted on was he voted to not enforce a gun locks provision, stating that people had to have locks for their guns. He voted against enabling that bill. He also voted to improve the rights of gun dealers. So prior to this, if gun dealers did something wrong or made a mistake, very frequently their gun license would be revoked very quickly. After this, gun dealers were now being judged on a tier system, where if they only kind of messed up, they'll just get a fine. But if they only kind of mess up a lot of times, they get their license revoked. So the punishment was fit to the crime, basically. So it made it harder to take a gun manufacturer's license away for doing something illegitimate or wrong. And Bernie Sanders voted in favor of that increased protection. So he also voted against the use of public funds for anti-firearms programs. Basically, on Native American tribes, public money was being given to the tribe, and part of that money was being used in anti-gun programs. And Bernie Sanders voted against allowing public funds to be used for anti-gun programs. He also voted against allowing public funds to be used for gun research, like gun violent research. So the federal government cannot put money into seeing how many people are hurt by guns in this way. It's pretty narrow, but Bernie Sanders voted against using public funds that way. Bernie Sanders also voted in favor of joining the UN Arms Treaty. I list that because the NRA and other gun enthusiasts wanted to not join, so it seemed relevant to this conversation. He voted against allowing concealed gun permits to be usable across state lines. So basically, if you had a concealed gun permit from Washington, under this law you'd be allowed to use that concealed gun permit in any state. Bernie Sanders voted against that level of freedom with the gun permits. He also voted in favor of limiting high-capacity gun magazines. He voted for a bill, which I can't believe needed to be a bill. It's Keep Guns Out of the Hands of Terrorists bill, and it seems really unnecessary, and I hope we were already trying to keep guns out of the hands of terrorists before this bill passed. It was probably a very symbolic bill, but he did vote in favor of it. He also voted in favor of closing the gun shop loophole twice, but he voted in favor of keeping the gun shop loophole once. It's important to note that his most recent votes were against the gun shop loophole, and the one that he voted in favor of keeping it was back in the 1990s, and that law also included a provision that stated there'd be a waiting period for gun purchases. So when there isn't a waiting period provision, he's voted in favor of closing the gun shop loophole. That's a very brief description of Bernie Sanders' history on gun policies, talking about a couple of the major policies and a few of the smaller ones. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like. And if you want future content, please subscribe. It's my first video, so thank you again for watching. Goodbye.